Your dog doesn't lie by your sister's grave. It's been digging at an unmarked grave for 3 months straight, and I think it knows something you don't." Those were the first words Jolene Mercer, the caretaker of Greenhill Cemetery, said straight to the face of Brennan Shaw, the most powerful man in Detroit. Her voice was calm, steady, without a trace of fear, standing before a man the entire city was too afraid to look in the eye. Brennan didn't believe her. He thought the 150-pound Neapolitan Mastiff was just a grieving dog, lying in the wrong spot, until the night he pried open the coffin beneath that unmarked grave himself and found it empty. Nothing inside but a silver ring identical to the one on his own hand, and a yellowed slip of paper with the date and time of a train that never departed. Kira Shaw, his sister, the one he had watched being lowered into the ground 6 months ago, had never been in that grave, and the dog knew it before anyone else did. If you want to find out where Kira is and who's behind it all, hit that like button to support us. Share this story with the people you love, because sometimes a story can change the way we see family. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. 6 months earlier, Greenhill Cemetery wasn't yet a place Brennan Shaw thought he would return to so many times. That day, the Detroit sky was gray as lead, and more than 300 people stood in a long line before a sealed coffin. Kira Shaw, 24 years old, the only younger sister of the most powerful boss in Detroit, had died in a runaway car accident that sent her vehicle plunging into a ravine outside the city. Her body was so badly damaged that it couldn't be identified by sight. The police confirmed her identity through her wallet, her phone, and the silver bracelet found inside the car. The coffin was kept closed from beginning to end, and no one saw her face one last time. Brennan stood in the front row, his back straight, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on the glossy black wooden lid without blinking. More than 300 people stood behind him, some afraid, some indebted, some there because they had to be there, but not one person stepped forward to stand beside him as an equal. Perry, his closest right-hand man, stood 3 steps behind him, his eyes red, but he didn't dare say a word. Brennan Shaw didn't cry. Not because he wasn't in pain, but because he didn't know how to cry in front of 300 people who were watching him as though they were looking at a wall of steel. The first person to step forward and shake Brennan's hand in condolence was Ronan Voss. He clasped Brennan's hand with both of his, said a few words of comfort, then stepped back. At the time, Brennan didn't think anything of it. Ronan was only an old family associate. But later, when everything came apart, Brennan would remember the look in Ronan's eyes as he shook his hand, and he would understand that it hadn't been condolence. It had been a test to see whether the prey had swallowed the bait. The funeral ended at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. One by one, people left, black cars following one another out through the cemetery gate. Brennan didn't leave. He sat down beside his sister's grave, on the damp grass, and stayed there until the sky had gone completely dark. Perry stood 20 meters away, leaning his back against an oak tree, not daring to call him, not daring to come closer. Near midnight, Brennan stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked toward the car. He didn't look back at the new headstone. From that day on, Brennan Shaw became a different man. It wasn't a change that happened slowly, but as if someone had turned off a switch inside him. Meetings with his men became shorter, decisions became more final, consequences became heavier for anyone who made a mistake. In the 6 months after the funeral, not a single person in the Shaw organization dared mention Kira's name in front of Brennan. Once, a new soldier accidentally asked about the photograph of the girl on the boss's desk. Perry dragged him outside at once and said exactly one sentence: "Don't ever ask that again." Men in the organization began whispering to one another. The boss lost the only part of him that was still human. The Shaw mansion was more than 500 square meters wide, but now it was empty in a way that space could never measure. Brennan lived alone, ate alone, drank alone in his darkened office every night, and then there was Coda, the black Neapolitan Mastiff weighing 150 pounds that Kira had raised by hand since he was a puppy. On the day of the funeral, Coda lay in front of Kira's bedroom door and didn't move. He didn't eat, didn't drink, and growled at anyone who came near. The men guarding the mansion walked around him. The housekeepers didn't dare open Kira's door. 150 pounds of muscle, with a wrinkled face, lay blocking the entrance like a watchful statue, and no one in the Shaw mansion dared order him to get up. On the 3rd day, Brennan came home late after a long meeting. He walked down the 2nd-floor hallway and saw Coda still lying there, his eyes open but vacant, the untouched bowl of food in front of him. Brennan said nothing. He sat down on the floor, right beside the dog, his back against the wall. He placed his hand on the animal's huge, wrinkled head. Coda gave a soft whimper, the first sound he had made in 3 days that wasn't a growl. He pressed his face into Brennan's hand, his eyes wet, his tail tucked low against the floor. At 2 a.m, Perry went upstairs to find the boss and report on business. He found Brennan still sitting on the floor, his hand still resting on Coda's head, both of them awake, and neither of them wanting anyone to see them like that. Perry turned away, walked back down the stairs, and made no report that night. 2 months after the funeral, things began to happen. Every morning, at exactly around 6 o'clock, when Detroit still wasn't fully bright, the 70-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff named Coda quietly slipped over the fence behind the Shaw mansion and disappeared. The first time, the men guarding the gate thought he was only wandering around and would come back. But by afternoon, Coda still hadn't returned, and Perry had to send people out to look for him. They found him at Greenhill Cemetery, more than 3 kilometers from the mansion. The next day, Coda escaped again. And the day after that. And the day after that. None of the men guarding the mansion dared stop him. 150 pounds of muscle, with that wrinkled face baring its teeth, and not one of Brennan Shaw's lackeys wanted to stand in that animal's way at 6 o'clock in the morning. After 2 weeks of Coda escaping without stopping, Perry brought the matter to Brennan. But what Perry said next was what made Brennan frown. "Boss, the dog isn't lying beside Miss Kira's grave. I already had someone follow him. He runs straight to the cemetery, but he doesn't go into Miss Kira's grave section. He lies in the far northern corner, beside an unnamed grave, and he digs. He digs up the ground there every day." Brennan didn't look up from the stack of papers on his desk. "He misses his owner and lies in the wrong spot. What does a dog know?" Perry said nothing more, but Coda didn't stop. The 3rd week, the 4th week, then the 2nd month, the 3rd month, and into the 4th month. For nearly 100 days, not a single day was missed. Every morning he climbed over the fence, and every afternoon Perry's men had to go bring him home. Until 6 months after the funeral, Brennan couldn't stand it anymore, and he decided to go to the cemetery himself to see what the hell the dog was doing there. 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the gate of Greenhill Cemetery on a late autumn afternoon. Brennan stepped out of the first vehicle, with Perry and 4 of his men following behind. They passed through the old iron gate, past rows of moss-covered headstones, heading toward the northern side of the cemetery, and Brennan saw a scene he had never expected. Coda, the dog who growled at the whole world, the dog no one in the Shaw mansion dared approach, was curled up at a woman's feet, silent, his tail gently wagging, his wrinkled head resting on her dirt-stained shoes. The woman was crouched down, pulling weeds beside a grave, with a shovel and a bucket of water beside her. She looked up when she heard footsteps, saw Brennan and his men coming toward her, and stood. She held the shovel in her hand, not exactly in a defensive position, but she didn't lower it either. "This is the land of the dead," she said, her voice calm, looking straight into Brennan's face without blinking. "No matter how many men you bring, you have no right to be here." One of the men behind Brennan took half a step forward. Brennan raised his right hand, without turning around, and everyone froze. The cemetery went utterly still. Brennan looked at the woman, then looked down at Coda lying at her feet. The dog lifted his head and looked at him, then pressed his face back against the woman's leg, as though he had already chosen. "Your dog has been running here every day for 3 months, the woman went on, her voice neither rising nor falling. "But he doesn't lie beside the person you buried in Section B. He digs up an unnamed grave right here. No matter how many times I fill it back in, he digs it up again, every single day." Brennan didn't answer. He looked at the grave Coda was lying beside, a small stone marker with no name, no date of birth, and no date of death. The ground around it had been clawed open, clearly marked by the paw prints of a 70-kilogram dog digging there for weeks. He stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and walked away. Not a word. His men followed one after another. Coda whimpered when he saw Brennan leave, but he didn't get up. He stayed there at the feet of the woman holding the shovel. On the way back, inside the SUV, Brennan sat in the back seat in silence for a very long time. Perry drove, watching him in the rearview mirror, waiting. At last, Brennan spoke. "Who is that girl?" Perry answered without needing to think, because he had already had someone look into her. "Jolene Mercer. the caretaker of Greenhill Cemetery, lives alone in the little house right beside the cemetery. No family, no relatives. She's been there for years. Brennan didn't ask anything else. He looked out through the window, watching the streets of Detroit slide past, and thought about the 70-kilogram dog lying at the feet of a strange woman in a cemetery, instead of beside his sister's grave. The next morning, Brennan drove an old model black sedan out of the mansion. No SUV, no men, no Perry. He went alone, and that was something that hadn't happened once in the past 6 months. The most powerful boss in Detroit never went anywhere without at least 2 men following him. But that morning, he drove through the empty streets at 7 o'clock, turned onto the dirt road leading to Greenhill Cemetery, and parked right in front of the iron gate. Jolene Mercer was watering a row of flowers in front of the eastern grave section when she heard the car. She looked up, saw Brennan walking through the gate alone, and straightened. Her eyes moved past his shoulder, out toward the road, then returned to him. "Yesterday you brought an army. Today you came alone. Why?" Brennan stopped a few steps away from her. "Because yesterday you said this is the land of the dead. I came to visit my sister. That only takes one man." Jolene looked at him for one more second, as if weighing whether that sentence was true or just an act. Then she set the watering can down. "What do you want?" "I need you to show me the grave the dog has been digging." Jolene asked nothing more. She turned and walked ahead, and Brennan followed. They passed through Section B, Row 3, where the stone marker engraved with Kira Shaw's name stood between 2 maple trees. Jolene slowed as they passed it, and spoke without turning around. "I water white daisies for her every day. I don't know what flowers she liked, but white daisies suit this place. It's been 6 months, and I haven't seen anyone visit her except the dog, and even he lies in the wrong spot." Brennan stopped. He looked at his sister's headstone, at the fresh white daisies placed in the small vase beside it, and at the neatly trimmed grass around it. A complete stranger had cared for his sister's grave for 6 months, while he himself hadn't returned here once since the day of the funeral. Brennan said nothing. He kept walking. They went a few more minutes toward the northern side of the cemetery, past rows of old, moss-stained graves, to a distant corner where the weeds grew tall and few people ever came. Jolene stopped in front of a small grave. The stone marker was low, with no name, no date, only a simple cross carved into its face. The ground around it had been torn open, claw marks cut deep into the damp soil, and in one place, the rotted wood of the coffin lid beneath had already been exposed. "Here," Jolene said. "He's been digging here for 3 months. Every day I fill it back in, and every day he digs it back up. Some days he digs until it's fully dark before he'll stop." Brennan crouched down, looking at the scratches in the soil, then at the nameless stone. "Whose grave is this?" "I don't know. An unnamed grave. This cemetery has dozens like it. People were buried here a long time ago, with no one to claim them and no one to visit." Jolene paused for a second, then continued. "But there's something strange. For the past few months, once a month, a little girl has come here. Around 8 or 9 years old, brought by an elderly neighbor woman. The child comes and places a small bouquet right here, right beside the unnamed grave where your dog lies. Once she's done, she leaves. She doesn't say anything to anyone." Brennan lifted his eyes to Jolene. "Do you know who the child is?" "No, but I've been noticing her for a long time. She comes on the exact day, at the exact hour, every month without fail. Every time, she leaves the flowers, stands looking at the grave for a while, then the old woman leads her away." Brennan stood. He looked at the unnamed grave, at the marks Coda had dug into the earth, then at Jolene. She stood there, her hands still stained with soil, her eyes looking straight into his without blinking, and he realized something he wasn't used to. This woman, a complete stranger who lived alone in a cemetery, had cared for his sister's grave every day, had watched the strange little girl every month, had remembered every unusual detail inside the cemetery, while he himself, a boss with hundreds of men under his command, hadn't set foot at Kira's grave once in half a year. Brennan gave Jolene a nod, turned around, and walked toward the cemetery gate. He didn't say thank you. But on the drive home, he didn't turn on music, didn't make a call, only sat silent behind the wheel and thought about a nameless grave his sister's dog dug at every day, and a strange little girl who brought flowers there every month. 3 days later, Brennan returned to Greenhill Cemetery for the 3rd time. This time, he didn't come alone. Perry drove, sitting silently in the front seat, because he knew that when the boss said, "Take me to the cemetery," in that voice, there should be no more questions. Brennan found Jolene filling in the dirt at the unnamed grave, the exact place Coda had dug up the day before. She looked up, saw him, then saw Perry standing behind him, and understood immediately that this time, he hadn't come to visit. "I want to dig up this grave," Brennan said, without circling around it. Jolene planted the shovel into the ground and stood straight. "No. Hear me out first. I heard you, and the answer is no." She looked straight into his eyes. "This is a resting place. Whether it's an unnamed grave or a grave with a name, the person lying beneath it deserves peace. You don't have the right to dig them up just because you want to know what's underneath." Brennan stayed silent for a while. Normally, when Brennan Shaw wanted something, he didn't need to persuade anyone. He only needed to nod, and things happened. But this was Jolene Mercer's cemetery, and he had seen clearly that she wasn't the kind of person who would step back because of his name or his power. So instead of giving an order, he did something that almost made Perry, standing behind him, forget how to breathe. Brennan persuaded her. "My sister's dog has been digging here for 3 months. He doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. He climbs the fence every morning and runs 3 kilometers here, then digs until dark. That dog growls at the whole world, but he lies quietly at your feet. He knows something I don't know, and I need you to help me find out what that is." Perry blinked. In 12 years of following Brennan Shaw, he had never once heard the boss use the word need with anyone. Jolene looked at Brennan for a very long time. Then she said, her voice lower but still firm, "If there are remains down there, you bury them again properly, in the right place, at the right depth, with the soil filled back in cleanly. If you can promise that, I'll agree. I promise." That night, at 11 o'clock, Greenhill Cemetery sank into darkness. No streetlights, no sound of cars, only the wind threading through the maple trees and the cry of insects in the grass. Brennan came with Perry and 2 others, carrying shovels and flashlights. Jolene was already waiting at the gate, holding an oil lamp in her hand, her face expressionless. Coda was lying right beside the unnamed grave, as if he knew something was going to happen tonight. When the group began to dig, Coda stood, moved closer to the hole, his nose lowered toward the earth, his tail tucked, his whole body tense. He didn't dig with them, but he didn't take his eyes off the hole as it slowly deepened. Brennan didn't stand there and watch. He took a shovel and dug alongside his men. The cemetery soil was damp and heavy, and every turn of the shovel brought up the smell of rotting roots and old mud. Perry watched the boss dig earth with his bare hands in a cemetery at midnight, and thought that 6 months ago, this could never have happened. But 6 months ago, Kira Shaw had still been alive. When the shovel struck wood, everyone stopped. The wooden coffin lid was rotted, cracked, and covered in damp soil. Brennan knelt, brushed away the remaining dirt on the lid with his hands, then pried the wood open. The lid came up. Inside, it was empty. No remains, no burial cloth, nothing at all. Only 2 things lay in the middle of the rotted wooden coffin bottom, a small silver ring and a yellowed piece of paper folded into quarters. Coda howled. It wasn't a bark, and it wasn't the growl everyone was used to hearing. It was a long, low howl that echoed across the cemetery in the still night, sounding like the call of an animal that knew something no one had been willing to hear. Jolene stood at the edge of the hole and shivered. Her hand gripped the sleeve of Brennan's coat, without her realizing she was doing it. Brennan picked up the silver ring, small, thin, with the letter K engraved inside. He held it up beneath the beam of the flashlight, then slowly brought his left hand beside it. On the ring finger of Brennan's left hand was an identical silver ring. Same design, same size, same material. Only one thing was different. The ring on his hand was engraved with the letter B, and the ring in the coffin was engraved with the letter K, a pair of sibling rings. Brennan had made these 2 rings when Kira was 16, on her birthday. He kept one, and his sister kept one. Kira wore it every day and never took it off. And now that ring was lying inside an empty grave, beneath a nameless stone marker, in the cemetery Coda had run to every day for 3 months. Brennan opened the yellowed piece of paper, handwriting, the ink faded but still readable. A day, an hour, and the number of a train leaving Detroit heading north. The schedule written on the paper was from the exact week Kira died, or, more accurately, the exact week everyone believed Kira had died. Brennan stood. He clenched the ring in his hand until his knuckles turned white. His face showed nothing, but Perry, who had followed Brennan Shaw for 12 years, understood that the look in the boss's eyes now wasn't anger, and it wasn't grief. It was the look of a man who had just been dragged out of 6 dark months by a single question. If Kira's ring was here, then where was Kira? Brennan turned to Perry, his voice as cold as steel cutting through the night air. Find me whoever buried this ring here. 48 hours. The 48 hours Brennan had given weren't a random number. It was the amount of time he knew he could keep himself calm before everything inside him began to collapse. Perry worked without sleep, but the first lead didn't come from the streets or from the Shaw organization's network. It came from Greenhill Cemetery, from a woman holding a shovel whom Brennan had almost overlooked. While Perry traced the origin of the ring and the piece of paper, Brennan personally went to meet the person he wanted to question first, the medical examiner who had signed Kira's death certificate 6 months earlier. The meeting took place in a small office in the basement of the county hospital. The doctor's name was Hargrove, a man in his 50s with gray hair and hands that trembled slightly when he saw Brennan Shaw sitting across from him on the other side of the iron table. Brennan said nothing. No threats. No pounding the table. No questions. He only sat there, his hands folded on the table, his eyes looking straight into Dr. Hargrove's face without blinking. Silence. 30 seconds of silence in that small room beneath the hospital, with Brennan Shaw sitting across from him, was enough to make an ordinary man begin to sweat. Dr. Hargrove confessed in less than 2 minutes. I wasn't the one who confirmed the identity. I only signed the papers based on the file the family representative provided. Brennan remained silent. The person who came to identify the body was Ronan Voss. He brought a power of attorney with Mr. Shaw's signature, saying Mr. Shaw wasn't strong enough to come identify her because he was too devastated. Brennan remembered. The week Kira died, he truly had been devastated. He had signed hundreds of papers Perry brought him without reading them, without asking, because at that time he didn't care whether he lived, much less whether he read a power of attorney. Was there anything unusual in the forensic file? Brennan asked, the first sentence he had spoken in the meeting. Dr. Hargrove swallowed. The location where the car was found in the police report didn't match the location recorded in the forensic file. It was off by nearly 15 kilometers, and the estimated time of death also differed from the reported time of the accident. I had questions then, but Mr. Voss said the family wanted it handled quickly, and I didn't ask anything more. Brennan stood and walked out without another word. Ronan Voss. That name had begun appearing in places where it shouldn't have been. At the same time, at Greenhill Cemetery, Jolene was doing her part. She knew the little girl who left flowers usually came on the 15th of every month. So that morning she sat waiting on the wooden bench beside the cemetery gate, with Coda lying at her feet. Near 10 o'clock, an old woman led a little girl through the gate by the hand. The girl held a small bouquet of wild daisies, walking beside the old woman, her small steps soft on the gravel path. Jolene hadn't had time to stand before Coda recognized her first. The 70-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff sprang up, his tail whipping, and rushed toward the little girl. The old woman startled and stepped back, but the little girl didn't. She dropped the bouquet, opened both arms wide, and hugged Coda's big, wrinkled, folded head. Coda! Coda! I missed Coda. The little girl laughed, both arms wrapped around the dog's neck, her face pressed into his glossy black fur. Coda licked her face, his tail wagging without stopping, whimpering with happiness. Jolene approached slowly and crouched down at the little girl's eye level. You know this dog? The little girl nodded, her arms still around Coda. I know Coda. My mom brought me to play with Coda before. Mom said Coda was Miss Kira's dog. Who is your mom? My mom's name was Whitfield, but my mom died. The little girl said it in a small voice, not sad in the way adults are sad, but sad in the way a child speaks of a truth she has learned to accept. Mom told me to bring flowers here every month for Miss Kira. Mom said Miss Kira was very sad. When Jolene heard that, she stood, looked toward the unnamed grave, then looked at the little girl smiling with Coda, and she understood that she was holding the piece Brennan Shaw needed. She called Brennan. That afternoon, Brennan, Perry, and Jolene stood before the small house at the end of the alley where Mrs. Whitfield had once lived. The elderly neighbor who had brought the little girl to leave flowers was the one keeping the house key after Mrs. Whitfield died of illness a few months earlier. The old woman opened the door for them without asking much, because when Brennan Shaw stood at someone's front door, people usually didn't ask. The house was small, neat, and clean in the way an older person living alone keeps a home. On the table in the living room, beside a vase of dried flowers and a photograph of the little girl, lay a hard-covered notebook, Mrs. Whitfield's diary. Perry found it, opened it, and began to read. The more he read, the paler his face became. He handed it to Brennan. In the diary, Mrs. Whitfield had written clearly and coherently, as though she had known there would come a day when someone would need to read these lines. She had been a nurse at the county hospital, where the body from Kira Shaw's burned car accident had been brought 6 months earlier. But Kira Shaw had not died in that accident. Kira came to Mrs. Whitfield 2 weeks before the accident, desperate, frightened, and begging for help. Kira told her everything. Her father, the old boss of the Shaw family, had signed a secret agreement with Ronan Voss before he died. The terms of the agreement were that Kira would marry Ronan in exchange for the Shaw family's control of the Detroit cargo port. Her father had sold her into a political marriage she had never agreed to, like a piece of property in a business deal. Kira couldn't tell Brennan because he was overseas handling business, and there was very little time left. Ronan had already begun forcing her to prepare for the engagement, so Mrs. Whitfield helped Kira stage everything. She switched the forensic files and placed the body of an unidentified person from the morgue into the coffin in Kira's place. The car fire was staged outside Detroit, and the body was so badly damaged that no one could identify it by sight. Kira disappeared. But before she disappeared, she did one thing. She went to Greenhill Cemetery, where she had often taken Coda for walks when she still lived in Detroit, and buried the silver ring engraved with the letter K, along with the piece of paper showing the train schedule she planned to use to leave the city, beneath an unnamed grave. It was her distress signal. She knew Coda would recognize her scent, would find the exact place, and if someone was patient enough to follow the dog, they would find the ring. Kira planned to board that train and leave Detroit for the north, to begin a new life, but she never made it to the station. Mrs. Whitfield's diary recorded that 2 months after Kira faked her death, Ronan Voss discovered she was alive. He had planted people to watch the train stations, bus depots, and hospitals around Detroit from the beginning, because he didn't believe in a death that was too clean in an accident. Ronan's men found Kira in a small town 3 hours by car from Detroit, where Mrs. Whitfield had hidden her. The diary stopped there. Mrs. Whitfield died before she ever learned what happened next. Brennan finished reading and closed the diary. He sat motionless in the old chair inside the small house of a dead nurse, and thought about his father. The man he had called father, the man who had built the Shaw empire from nothing, had sold his sister into a political marriage the way someone sells an item in a business agreement. Jolene stood by the window, watching Brennan. She didn't ask anything. She only said, softly, as though speaking more to herself than to him, "I have 347 people lying out there in the cemetery. They never leave." Brennan lifted his eyes to look at her. She looked back at him. No further explanation. But Mrs. Whitfield's diary hadn't told everything. That night, when Brennan brought the notebook back to the mansion and read it again from the beginning in his darkened office, he found a passage he had skimmed over that afternoon. Mrs. Whitfield had written, "The night before everything began, Kira sat in my kitchen, her hands shaking, and called her brother. She called 7 times in a row. He didn't answer once. She left a message on the last call, then put the phone down on the table and cried without making a sound. I asked her if she wanted to try calling again. She shook her head and said, 'He's busy, probably like always.'" Brennan read that passage twice. Then he set the diary down, opened the drawer of his desk, and took out the old phone he had used 6 months earlier. He had kept it, not for any particular reason, only because he couldn't throw away anything that belonged to the time when Kira was still alive. The phone still had battery. He opened the call history and scrolled back to 2 weeks before the day Kira died. 7 missed calls from Kira, 7 calls in a row in one night, from 10 o'clock in the evening until nearly 1 in the morning. Brennan remembered that night. He had been in Chicago, in a long meeting with transportation partners moving goods through the port. The phone had vibrated in his coat pocket. He had seen Kira's name appear, and he had silenced it. The second time, he silenced it. The third time, he placed the phone face down on the table. The 4th, 5th, and 6th times, he didn't look anymore. At the time, he had thought, Kira was probably calling to complain about something again. Calling her back tomorrow would be fine. The next day, he forgot. The next week, Kira died. After the funeral, he opened the phone saw the 7 missed calls, and felt as if someone had driven a blade into his chest. But back then, he thought they were only 7 ordinary calls he had missed, and that pain was only the pain of an older brother who hadn't managed to speak to his sister one last time. Now, sitting in the darkened office, knowing the truth, knowing Kira had called because she was afraid, because she was desperate, because she needed him, those 7 calls meant something entirely different. Brennan tapped the last call. There was a voicemail. For 6 months, he had never listened to that voicemail. He pressed play. Kira's voice filled the dark room, trembling, small, and tired in the way of someone who had been crying for a very long time before pressing record. "Brother, I need you. I'm so scared, but you're probably busy, like always." The message ended. 4 seconds of silence before the beep cut off. Brennan sat motionless. Then he threw the phone at the wall across from him. The phone hit the wall, split into 2 pieces, and fell onto the wooden floor. He wasn't angry at Kira. He wasn't angry at Mrs. Whitfield. He wasn't angry at Ronan Voss, though that name was burning inside him. He was angry at himself, because he had sat in a conference room in Chicago and silenced his phone 7 times while his sister was calling for help, because he had spent his whole life building an empire, expanding territory, counting money, counting power, while the only person who truly needed him couldn't get him to answer, because he was like his father, putting power above family, putting deals above blood, and calling it responsibility. Perry heard something shatter from the hallway outside. He walked to the office door, stood there for 3 seconds, then turned and left. He knew no one should go in right now. But Jolene didn't know that rule. She was downstairs, in Kira's library. She was at the mansion because Brennan had invited her there, so they could review the clues from Mrs. Whitfield's diary together. She passed Perry standing in the hallway, and Perry didn't stop her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he saw something on her face that he understood. She was going in whether he stopped her or not. Jolene opened the office door. Brennan sat behind the desk, both hands covering his face, the broken phone lying beneath the wall. She didn't ask what had happened. She walked to the pieces of the phone, bent down to pick them up, and placed the 2 pieces close together on the desk, right in front of Brennan. Then she stood there, silent, waiting. Brennan lowered his hands. His eyes were red, but dry. He looked at the broken phone on the desk, then looked at Jolene. "She called me 7 times. 7 times in one night. I didn't answer a single one." Jolene said nothing for a few seconds. Then she spoke, her voice soft, calm, the way she said everything. "She called you because she trusted you. People don't call 7 times for someone they blame. They only call 7 times for someone they believe will answer. Even if he doesn't answer this time, then he'll answer the next." Brennan swallowed. "I'm like my father." Jolene looked straight at him, without blinking. "Your father signed an agreement to sell your sister, then died without ever coming back to fix it. You're sitting here, reading a diary, digging up a grave, questioning a doctor, searching for a little girl, trying to find the truth. Your father never came back to look for answers. You are looking. That's the difference." The office fell silent. Outside in the hallway, Perry leaned against the wall, heard everything. And for the first time in 12 years of following Brennan Shaw, he saw someone walk into the boss's room while the boss was falling apart and not get thrown out. Not because Jolene Mercer was brave, but because she had said exactly what Brennan needed to hear, at exactly the moment he needed to hear it most. Ronan Voss wasn't the kind of man who sat still and waited to have his hand exposed. He had eyes and ears all over Detroit, and when Brennan Shaw began digging up a grave in the cemetery, questioning a medical examiner, and turning the house of a dead nurse upside down, those eyes reported back to Ronan in less than 24 hours. Ronan didn't strike Brennan directly. He was smarter than that. He struck where Brennan wasn't guarded. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 days after the night Brennan threw the phone into the wall, 2 unmarked trucks stopped in front of the gate of Greenhill Cemetery. 4 men stepped down, carrying gasoline cans and torches. They went straight toward the little house beside the cemetery, where Jolene Mercer lived alone. But they hadn't counted on Coda. The 70-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff was lying on Jolene's porch, and when he heard unfamiliar footsteps at 2 o'clock in the morning, he stood up, 150 pounds of muscle, his wrinkled, folded face pulling tight, his teeth flashing white in the dark, and a low growl from deep inside his chest, rumbling like a diesel engine. The first 2 men stopped dead. They had come here to burn down the house of a girl who lived alone in a cemetery, and no one had told them about the dog. Coda charged down the steps, growling, and planted himself between the men and Jolene's door. Two of them backed away. One threw a gasoline can toward the wall of the house from a distance, another tossed the torch, and all of them ran back to the truck. Fire caught the old wooden wall faster than anyone could react. Jolene woke because of the smell of smoke. She rolled out of bed, crawled low beneath the black smoke, and slipped out through the back door. Coda ran around to meet her, pressed his head against her body, and tugged at her clothes, pulling her away from the burning house. Jolene sat on the sidewalk across the road, holding Coda, watching her little house go up in flames. The firefighters arrived 15 minutes later. By then, the roof had already collapsed. Perry called Brennan at 3 o'clock in the morning. "Boss, the cemetery girl's house was burned." Brennan didn't ask another question. He drove to the cemetery in 12 minutes, a distance that normally took at least 25. When he arrived, the fire had already been put out. The house was nothing but a blackened wooden frame, still smoking. Jolene sat on the sidewalk, soot on her face, her hair disheveled, her arms around Coda. She didn't cry. Her eyes looked at the ruins in front of her. Dry and calm in the way only people who have lost too many things in life can be calm. Brennan walked up in front of her. She lifted her eyes to him. "They burned all my books. Not the house, not the furniture, not clothes or money. Books." That was the only thing she mentioned, and Brennan understood at once that it was the only thing that had truly been valuable to her. He knelt down in front of Jolene. The most powerful boss in Detroit, the man no one in the entire city dared look straight in the eyes, knelt on the sidewalk at 3 o'clock in the morning before a girl with soot on her face, holding a 70-kilogram dog. He took off his coat, placed it over her shoulders, and said nothing. Then he reached out his hand. Jolene looked at his hand. In all 27 years of her life, she had gotten up on her own every time she fell. No one had ever offered her a hand. No one had ever knelt down to meet her at eye level. She looked at Brennan Shaw's hand, then took it, and stood. Brennan brought Jolene back to the Shaw mansion. Coda came with them, sitting in the back seat, his huge wrinkled head poking out the window the whole way. When they arrived at the mansion, Brennan didn't lead Jolene to the living room or the sitting room. He led her up to the second floor, down the hallway, and stopped in front of an oak door. He opened it. Inside was a large room, with 3 walls covered in bookshelves from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of books, neatly arranged, their spines in all different colors beneath the warm yellow light. A brown leather reading chair sat beside the window. A pair of old ballet shoes rested on a small shelf near the door. "My sister liked reading too. This room was hers. Now you use it." Brennan said it in an ordinary voice, as though he were speaking about the weather, not opening the room he had kept locked for 6 months. The room no one in the mansion had dared step inside. The room Coda had guarded outside the door for 3 days after the funeral. Jolene stepped in. She walked slowly, her eyes moving over the shelves, then stopped in front of one of them. She reached out and touched the spine of an old book, gently, the way people touch something precious when they're afraid it might break. Her eyes were wet. She didn't cry out loud, didn't sob, only stood there with wet eyes. It was the first time Brennan had seen Jolene Mercer not look calm. He said nothing more. He closed the door, leaving her alone there with the books and Kira's old ballet shoes, then went downstairs to call Perry and begin tracking down the men who had burned her house. From that night on, Jolene stayed at the Shaw mansion, and from the next morning onward, every day when Jolene opened the door and stepped out onto the second-floor terrace, there was always a cup of coffee, still hot, waiting on the small table outside. No one said who put it there. Jolene didn't ask. Brennan didn't mention it. Perry knew, but Perry said nothing. Every morning, hot coffee on the small table outside the terrace, and the two of them said nothing about it. 2 days after the house fire, Brennan's phone received a message from an unknown number. Brief. The name of a restaurant, an hour, and a single sentence. 2 people, no weapons. Something needs to be said. Brennan knew at once who had sent it. Castellano was in Detroit's central financial district, owned by a third party with no connection to either Shaw or Voss. Neutral ground. In the world Brennan lived in, places like this existed for one purpose only. So 2 men who could kill each other at any moment could sit across from one another without anyone dying. The unspoken rule. No weapons at the negotiating table. Soldiers wait outside. and whoever breaks the rule gets handled by both sides. Brennan arrived on time. Perry and 2 of his men stood outside the restaurant door, their faces tense. On the opposite side, 3 of Ronan Voss's men also stood outside, arms folded across their chests, their eyes never leaving Perry's group. Inside, the restaurant was empty. Ronan had rented out the entire second floor for the evening. 1 table, 2 chairs, 1 bottle of red wine, 2 glasses. Ronan Voss was already seated, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded on the table, calm as a man waiting for an old friend to arrive for dinner. He wore a dark gray suit, spoke softly, and smiled just enough to show confidence without turning it into arrogance. When Brennan sat down across from him, Ronan poured wine into both glasses and pushed one toward Brennan. "It's been a long time since we sat down and talked properly," Ronan said, his voice gentle. Brennan didn't touch the glass. He looked at Ronan, silent, waiting. Ronan didn't rush. He took a sip of wine, set the glass down, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small black USB drive, placing it in the middle of the table, right beside the wine bottle. "This contains proof of every transaction the Shaw family has made over the past 20 years. Every shipment, every payment, every name, every route. I planted someone inside your organization a long time ago, Brennan. Collected it piece by piece, patiently, without hurrying. Like playing chess. No one wins with 1 move. People win because of the 20 moves that came before it." Brennan looked at the USB drive, then looked back at Ronan. "What do you want?" The Detroit port was only the beginning. Ronan leaned forward, his voice still soft, but his eyes were not. "I want the entire Shaw empire. The port, the warehouses, the transportation routes, the distribution network. All of it. You sign the transfer papers. And I keep this USB drive in a safe where no one ever sees it. You refuse. I send a copy to the FBI before tomorrow morning, and you spend the rest of your life in federal prison." Brennan sat motionless. In 12 years of running the Shaw organization, he had faced dozens of enemies, hundreds of threats, but never once had he been backed into a corner by intelligence instead of guns. Ronan didn't need violence. He only needed a USB drive the size of a finger and 20 years of patience. "I never step into a game without an exit," Ronan added, taking another sip of wine. "Your father taught me that. He was a good teacher. Too bad he didn't teach you." Brennan stood, without saying a word, and walked out of the restaurant. Ronan didn't chase him. He didn't need to. He knew the USB drive had said everything for him. In the car, Perry drove, and Brennan sat in the back seat. Both of his hands gripped the back of the front seat, his knuckles white. Perry looked into the rearview mirror, saw the boss's face, and didn't ask. Silence stretched the whole way back. At last, Brennan spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "He has everything, Perry. For the first time, I don't know what to do." Perry tightened his grip on the steering wheel. In 12 years, he had never heard Brennan Shaw say that sentence. When they returned to the mansion, Brennan didn't go to his office. He went straight up to the second floor, walked down the hallway, and stopped in front of Kira's library door. The door was slightly open. The desk lamp cast a warm, golden glow. Jolene was sitting in the brown leather reading chair beside the window, her legs tucked beneath her on the chair, an open book resting on her lap. She didn't hear him, or perhaps she heard him and didn't turn around. Brennan stood in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the wooden frame, and watched her read. She was sitting in his sister's room, beneath the yellow light, surrounded by hundreds of books Kira had once touched, and she looked so peaceful that Brennan felt as though he were looking into another world, a world where no USB drive, no Ronan Voss, no 20 years of sin could reach. He stood there for nearly 1 minute, then he turned away, walked back to his room, closed the door, and sat alone in the dark. He didn't tell Jolene about the restaurant. He didn't need her comfort. He only needed to know she was there, in that room, safe, and sometimes just seeing one peaceful person is enough to keep a drowning man from letting go. The next morning, before Brennan could think of a way to deal with the USB drive, Ronan struck another blow. Brennan's phone received a video from an unknown number, a video that was 23 seconds long. He opened it. In the video was an old train car, dark, with light slipping through the cracks of a rusted iron door. A woman sat on the floor of the train car, her back against the iron wall, her hands resting on her knees. Thin, pale, her hair tangled, her clothes wrinkled, clearly exhausted. But her eyes looked straight into the camera, not begging, not crying, not lowering her head. Kira Shaw, Brennan's sister, alive. The video ended. Immediately after that came a message. Detroit Port. All Shaw assets. No negotiation. You have 48 hours. Brennan watched the video 3 times. Then he set the phone down on the desk, buried his face in both hands, and breathed. Only breathed. Because if he did anything else in that moment, he would destroy everything within reach. Kira was alive. For 6 months, he had stood before a false grave. For 6 months, he had believed he had lost his sister forever, and she was sitting inside some old train car, wasted thin, but still looking straight into the eyes of the man holding her without lowering her head. She was still Kira, and Ronan Voss had her. But the question burning through Brennan now wasn't how to save Kira. It was how Ronan knew his every move. He knew Brennan had dug up the grave, knew he had found Dr. Hargrove, knew he had gone to Mrs. Whitfield's house, knew where Jolene was so he could send people to burn her house. He knew faster than any rumor on the street. Someone was reporting to him from inside the Shaw organization. It took Brennan 2 hours to confirm the thing he didn't want to believe. He checked every piece of information again. Who knew he had gone to dig up the grave? Who knew he had met Dr. Hargrove? Who knew he had gone to Mrs. Whitfield's house? Each time, only one name appeared on every list. Perry. Perry, who had followed him for 12 years. Perry, who had stood outside the door when he threw the phone. Perry, who had driven him to the restaurant to meet Ronan. Perry, who knew everything because Brennan trusted him enough never to hide anything from him. Brennan called Perry into the office and closed the door. A small room, 1 desk, 2 chairs, yellow light. Brennan sat on one side. Perry sat across from him. On the desk, between the two of them, Brennan placed his gun. Not aimed at anyone. Just laid there, on the oak surface, the barrel turned to one side, like an ornament whose meaning both men understood. In Brennan Shaw's world, a gun on the table wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. There are laws no one writes down but everyone knows, and the punishment for betrayal is one of those laws. Brennan asked exactly one question. How long? Perry didn't deny it. He didn't look down, didn't tremble, didn't beg for mercy. He looked straight into Brennan's face, and he answered, Since you started digging up the grave. About 3 weeks. Why? Perry swallowed. My daughter. Ronan had people take her somewhere else, right after you started investigating. He sends me pictures of her every day. She's still healthy, still being cared for, but I'm not allowed to see her. He said if I reported your every move, she would come home to me when everything was over. If I didn't, Perry didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Brennan understood. Perry was a single father. His daughter was the only child he had in the world, and Ronan Voss knew that. Where is Kira? Brennan asked, his voice flat. At the abandoned train station on the western edge of the city, near Greenhill Cemetery, about 2 kilometers as the crow flies. Ronan is keeping her there, in an old train car. There are 4 men guarding her, changing shifts every 12 hours. Brennan looked at the gun on the table. Then he looked at Perry. In his world, the law was simple. Betrayal meant death. No exceptions, no circumstances, no buts, no because. Perry knew that law. Perry had lived by that law for 12 years. And Perry had broken that law for his daughter. Brennan reached for the gun. Perry didn't move. He didn't run, didn't plead, didn't close his eyes. He sat there, looking at Brennan, and waited. He's also just a father trying to save his child. Jolene's voice sounded from the doorway. She stood there, leaning against the frame, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes on Brennan. No one knew how long she had been standing there. She didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't rush in to stand between them. She only spoke, in that calm voice she always used. The voice Brennan had heard enough times to know that when she was calm, it meant she was saying the most important thing. You're turning all of Detroit upside down for your sister. He betrayed his boss for his daughter. The two of you are more alike than you think. The only difference is that you have the power to search, and he had only one way, which was to obey the man holding his child. The room went silent. Brennan looked at Jolene. Then he looked at Perry. Then he looked at the gun in his hand. He removed the magazine and placed it on the desk. Then he threw the empty gun into the corner of the room. The sound of metal striking the wall rang out dry and hard. Once, Brennan said, looking straight into Perry's eyes, Only once. Perry bowed his head. His shoulders shook. 12 years of loyalty, 3 weeks of betrayal, and 1 shot that was never fired. That was the night Brennan Shaw broke his own law. Ronan Voss struck his next blow at the exact moment Brennan thought he had begun to bring the situation under control. At noon the next day, while Brennan was downstairs with Perry, discussing the plan to approach the abandoned train station, a police car pulled up in front of the Shaw mansion gate. 2 people in uniform stepped out, handed papers to the men guarding the gate, and said they needed to meet Miss Jolene Mercer so she could sign confirmation documents for the insurance file on the burned house at Greenhill Cemetery. Administrative procedure, about 15 minutes, and she needed to be present at the scene. The men at the gate looked at the police car, looked at the uniforms, looked at the papers with the red stamp, and didn't stop them. In Brennan Shaw's world, his men were taught to be wary of enemies on the street, not police officers arriving to handle insurance paperwork. Jolene stepped out, got into the back seat of the police car, and the car drove away. She didn't suspect anything. She had lived 27 years outside that lawless world in the sense that she had never been tied to any organization, so when the police came and talked about insurance papers, she thought it was a normal matter, someone who had lost a house needed to handle. The car didn't go to the police station. It turned onto the road leading to Greenhill Cemetery, and by the time Jolene realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Ronan Voss was waiting beside a black SUV in front of the cemetery gate, his hands in his pockets, his face calm as a man waiting for a taxi. The 2 police officers opened the car door for Jolene to get out. She understood immediately. She didn't scream, didn't run. She looked at Ronan, then at the 2 fake police officers. And she knew that screaming or running now would both be useless. 10 minutes later, Brennan's phone received a message. "Now I have both of your women. Detroit Port. Tonight. No negotiation." Brennan read the message, then read it again, then read it a 3rd time. Perry stood across from him, looking at the boss's face, and saw something he had never seen in 12 years. Brennan Shaw's hands were shaking, not shaking from fear, shaking because, for 1 second, everything he had tried to hold on to after 6 dark months, the only 2 people who still made him feel like a human being instead of a machine, were both in the hands of the enemy. He thought of Jolene, of the way she had once told him, in her familiar, calm voice, that the most dangerous kind of person wasn't the kind who could kill others, but the kind who made others want to stay even when they knew they should leave. At the time, he had listened and given no answer. Now, standing in his office with Ronan's message on the screen, he understood that she was dangerous to him in exactly that way. She made him want to keep her there, and now he could lose her. "Perry," Brennan said, his voice deep and slow, every word heavy as stone. "He's holding the only 2 people who still make me want to wake up every morning." Perry said nothing. He only nodded, because he understood. He understood better than anyone, because he had just lived through that feeling with his own daughter. At the same time, in the abandoned train station 2 kilometers from Greenhill Cemetery, Jolene was taken into the last train car of the old line of cars, resting on broken tracks. Inside, the train car was dark and cold, smelling of rusted iron and old engine oil. Light slipped through the cracks in the car walls, falling in thin strips across the iron floor. And in the corner of the train car, leaning back against the wall, a woman sat with her legs drawn up, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. Thin, pale, her hair tangled, but when she heard the train car door open and the sound of footsteps, she opened her eyes. Kira Shaw looked at Jolene as she stepped in, and though she had never met this woman, though she had been held here for many months with very little information from the outside world, she recognized her, not by her face or her voice, but by elimination. Ronan never brought anyone in here except guards. If he brought a woman in, it meant that woman mattered to someone Ronan wanted to pressure. And the only person Ronan was pressuring was her brother. "You're Jolene," Kira said, her voice hoarse and weak, but her eyes still bright. "How do you know my name?" Jolene asked, genuinely surprised. Kira gave a faint smile, the tired smile of someone who had gone too long without a reason to smile. "My brother has never mentioned any woman's name twice in his life. I overheard a few of Ronan's calls when he was talking to someone outside. Your name, my brother mentioned more than that." Jolene stood still for 1 second. Then she walked to Kira's side, sat down on the cold train car floor, and took the hand of the girl whose false grave she had watered with white daisies for 6 months without ever knowing. "Your brother will come," Jolene said, her voice calm and certain, the way she said everything. And that huge, wrinkled-faced dog will come too. Kira laughed, this time more truly, though weakly. A small laugh sounded inside the dark train car. Coda. Yes, Coda. That dog is more loyal than anyone I've ever met. Jolene held Kira's hand tighter. Except one person. The two women sat inside the old train car, hand in hand, not crying, not begging, not collapsing. One had been held there for months and still looked straight ahead. One had just been tricked into coming there and still remained calm, and both of them were waiting for the same man. Brennan was standing before the map of the abandoned train station that Perry had redrawn from memory, discussing the attack plan for tonight, when a sound from downstairs made the entire room go still. A crash, then the sound of iron, striking iron, then the sound of feet running over gravel. Coda broke through the gate. The massive Neapolitan Mastiff charged through the iron gate of the Shaw mansion, as if that gate were made of paper. The two men guarding the gate jumped aside. No one reacted in time, and no one dared stand in his way either. Coda ran straight into the street, all four paws pounding the asphalt, 150 pounds of muscle rushing in one single direction without turning, without stopping, without looking back. Brennan ran to the door and watched the dog disappear at the end of the street in the dark. He didn't need anyone to explain. He knew where Coda was going. The dog had caught Kira's scent. The abandoned train station was only 2 kilometers from Greenhill Cemetery, and Coda had been going back and forth to the cemetery every day for 3 months. The nose of a Neapolitan Mastiff could pick up the scent of an old owner from a distance much greater than that. "Follow the dog," Brennan ordered, his voice short, sharp, without one wasted word. "Everyone into the cars. Move now." Within 3 minutes, 4 black SUVs left the Shaw mansion, heading in the direction where Coda had disappeared. Perry sat in the first car, his phone open to the map, his eyes fixed on the west, where the abandoned train station lay. Brennan sat in the second car, his back straight, his eyes forward, and he didn't say a single word the entire way. When the convoy got close to the station, Brennan ordered them to stop about half a kilometer away. He called Perry over the radio. "Ronan will place his men at the main entrance on the east side. He wants me to walk in exactly where he's waiting, but the dog isn't running east." It was true. Coda didn't go through the main entrance. The dog circled behind the station, following the old broken tracks, where the weeds grew waist-high and there were no lights. Coda followed scent by instinct, not by any human plan, and that was exactly why he entered from the direction Ronan Voss would never think of. Brennan divided the team into 3 groups. Group 1 followed the old tracks from behind, following Coda's trail. Group 2 circled around the left side of the station. Group 3 held position at the main entrance as a diversion. Brennan went with Group 1. Perry stepped forward and stood beside Brennan, his face tense but his eyes determined. "Boss, let me go first. You don't need to prove anything. I betrayed you. You spared me, but I haven't forgiven myself. Let me go first." Brennan looked at Perry for 1 second. Then he nodded. They moved through the old tracks in the dark, following Coda's paw prints in the soft dirt. The abandoned train station appeared ahead of them. A low red brick building with peeling paint, a rusted sheet metal roof, and 7 old train cars sitting on the broken tracks behind it, lined up in a long row in the darkness. Flashlights flickered from the east, where Ronan's men were guarding the main entrance. But behind the station, where Brennan's group entered, it was pitch black. No lights, no people. Ronan didn't think anyone would come in from the broken tracks. He was wrong. Once Brennan's group reached the rear platform, everything happened very quickly. Perry and 3 men moved forward, disabling 2 guards at the 3rd train car before they could signal anyone. The noise was small, but enough for Ronan to know something was wrong. He stepped out from the 5th train car, where he had been waiting for Brennan to enter through the front and fall into the trap. He hadn't expected Brennan to come from behind. Brennan stepped out of the darkness, standing in the middle of the platform, 10 steps away from Ronan. The 2 bosses faced each other in the abandoned train station, beneath the rusted metal roof, among the dead train cars. Ronan remained calm, even though the plan had fallen apart. He spoke first. "She always belonged to me, Brennan. That was the agreement your father signed, in blood and in ink. You can destroy everything I've built, but you can't break the agreement of a dead man." Brennan looked at Ronan. 6 months ago, he had shaken this man's hand at the funeral. 6 months ago, Ronan had stood before his sister's coffin and spoken words of condolence that Brennan now understood had been words of examination. "My father was wrong. Brennan said, his voice low, each word heavy. "And I won't repeat that mistake." Ronan didn't get the chance to answer before Brennan moved. Fast, decisive, the way he made every decision in his life. Ronan raised his hands to defend himself. But Brennan Shaw wasn't the kind of boss who sat behind a desk giving orders. He had grown up on the streets of Detroit, and the streets had taught him that sometimes power wasn't in a USB drive or in an agreement on paper, but in who was still standing after the first blow. Brennan knocked Ronan down onto the platform with a shoulder strike, then pinned him in place with a knee against his back. Ronan struggled for a few seconds, then stopped, his face pressed against the cold concrete floor. "You're going to live," Brennan said, his breathing heavy. "In prison. Death would be too easy for you." At the same time, on the eastern side of the station, Ronan's men realized the plan had collapsed and began to retreat. Perry blocked their escape route at the northern exit. 2 men rushed at Perry. He fought back, threw 1 man down, but the second one twisted and rammed into Perry's left shoulder. Perry fell, pain tearing through his left shoulder, but he held tightly to the man until Brennan's men ran over and restrained him. Brennan came to Perry, who was lying on the platform floor, his right hand gripping his left shoulder, his face twisted in pain. "Your daughter is waiting. Don't die." Perry gave a crooked smile, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Boss, I'm hurt in the shoulder, not the head." While the platform fell into chaos, Coda had gone ahead of everyone. The 70-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff didn't care who was fighting whom, or who was running where. He cared about only one thing: the scent he had followed for 3 months in the cemetery, the scent he had never forgotten even after 6 months apart. Coda slipped through the 5th train car, then the 6th, crawled beneath the 7th, and stopped before the final train car. The door was locked tight, with an iron chain. Coda clawed at the door, whining, his nose pressed into the crack. Inside, Kira heard the scratching. She had heard fighting out on the platform, had heard shouting, had heard running, but she didn't know who had won. Not until she heard the scratching at the door and the whimper she recognized instantly, even after not hearing it for 6 months. "Coda," she whispered. Jolene had already freed her own bound hands earlier with a piece of rusted iron she had found on the train car floor. She stood, using all her strength to pull the door latch from inside. The door opened. Coda charged in. 150 pounds rushed straight to Kira, pressing his huge, wrinkled head full of folds against her face. Kira lifted her trembling hands, touched the familiar wrinkles on the dog's face, and tears fell before she could hold them back. "Coda, you found me," Coda whimpered, lay down beside Kira, placed his head on her lap, and slowly wagged his tail. He didn't move away. He had found the person he had searched for through 3 long months. Jolene knelt beside Kira and held her hand. "You're safe now." Heavy footsteps sounded outside the train car door. Brennan Shaw stood in the doorway of the final car, his breathing still uneven, his hands scraped, his eyes sweeping through the darkness inside. And then he saw them. Kira, his sister, sitting on the train car floor, holding Coda, her eyes filled with tears. Jolene kneeling beside her, her hand holding Kira's. The 70-kilogram dog lying between them, his wrinkled head resting on Kira's lap, his eyes wet, his tail wagging. Brennan stood in the doorway. His legs wouldn't move. The most powerful boss in Detroit, the man who had taken Ronan Voss down 3 minutes earlier, stood in the doorway of an old train car and couldn't step inside because his legs were shaking. Kira lifted her eyes to him. "Brother," Brennan stepped in, 1 step at a time. Then he knelt in front of his sister. He held Kira. He couldn't say anything. Not 1 word came out of his mouth. 6 months standing before a false grave. 6 months believing he had lost his sister forever. 6 months of not crying in front of anyone. And for the first time in 6 months, Brennan Shaw cried. Not loudly, not sobbing, only tears running down his face inside the dark train car. While he held his sister, the dog lay beside them, and Jolene sat nearby in silence, letting brother and sister have that moment. The ambulance arrived at the abandoned train station 15 minutes after everything was over. Kira was placed on a stretcher, given fluids right there in the ambulance, then taken straight to the county hospital. Brennan sat beside the stretcher the entire way, holding his sister's hand, not saying a word. Kira kept her eyes closed, breathing lightly, her fingers curling around his finger the way she used to do as a little girl whenever she was afraid. At the hospital, the doctor said Kira was exhausted, severely dehydrated, and needed at least a few days of observation before she could be discharged. Brennan nodded, then pulled a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, sat down, and didn't get up until the next morning. He sat there all night, his back against the hard plastic chair, his eyes fixed on his sister lying in the hospital bed with an IV in her hand. And he thought that 6 months earlier, he had watched her coffin being lowered into the ground. For 6 months, he had believed she was lying beneath cold earth, when in truth, she had been inside a rusted train car only 2 kilometers from her false grave. Outside the hospital entrance, Coda lay on the sidewalk, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes fixed on the glass doors. The hospital security guard looked at the 70-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff blocking the entrance, considered chasing him away, then decided not to. Perry, his shoulder bandaged by the paramedics, arrived at the hospital in one of the SUVs. He stood beside Coda for a while, patted his head, then had his driver take him home. The dog didn't move. He waited. Near noon the next day, Kira opened her eyes. The hospital lights were glaring white. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, and the heart monitor beeped steadily. She turned her head to the side and saw Brennan sitting in the plastic chair beside the bed, dark circles under his eyes, his shirt still dusty from the night before, and the scratches on his hands not yet washed. She looked at him, and the first thing Kira Shaw said after waking up in the hospital, after 6 months of pretending to be dead, after months of captivity, after one night of being rescued, was, "You cry ugly." Brennan, the man who hadn't slept all night, the man who had taken Ronan Voss down with his bare hands only hours earlier, the man all of Detroit feared, looked at his sister and said, "Shut up." Kira laughed, weakly, but it was a real laugh, the laugh Brennan thought he would never hear again. Then the smile faded, and Kira's eyes turned serious. "Brother, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I let you stand there crying in front of a false grave for 6 months. I know you were in pain. I know you fell apart, and I couldn't tell you the truth because I was afraid that if you knew, you'd come looking for me, and Ronan would use you to find me." Brennan was silent for a while. Then he said, his voice low, gentler than any time he had spoken in the past 6 months, "I'm sorry I didn't answer those 7 calls." Kira tightened her grip on his hand. She looked up at the hospital ceiling, her eyes wet but not crying. "Brother, when I was locked in that train car, I wasn't afraid of dying. I had been ready for that for a long time. What I was afraid of was that you'd never know. I didn't want to leave you. I never wanted to leave you. I only wanted to leave the cage Father built for me. The cage he called protection, called love, when really, he was locking me into a life I didn't choose." Brennan swallowed. He thought of his father, of the agreement he had signed with Ronan, of the way he ran the family the same way he ran the organization, through orders, through control, through arrangements no one was allowed to question. And he thought of himself, of the 7 missed calls, of the years he had spent building an empire while forgetting that his sister was suffocating. "I won't build cages for anyone anymore," Brennan said. It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was only a small sentence in a hospital room, between a brother and sister, and both of them knew what it meant. 3 days later, Kira was strong enough to sit in a wheelchair. The doctor said she needed more time to recover, but allowed her to go out into the hospital courtyard for some fresh air. Brennan pushed his sister's wheelchair down the white hallway, through the glass doors at the back, and into the small courtyard planted with several maple trees. Coda was still lying there. For 3 days, he had lain outside the hospital entrance, and no one could make him leave. The security guards had given up. The nurses brought him water and food, because no one had the heart to let a 70-kilogram dog wait for his owner while hungry. When the glass doors opened and Brennan pushed Kira's wheelchair into the courtyard, Coda lifted his head. He saw Kira. He stood up. 150 pounds charged across the courtyard in 3 seconds, claws scraping against the concrete, drool flying in the wind, his big wrinkled head wobbling from side to side because he was wagging his tail so hard he almost lost his balance. He stopped in front of the wheelchair, placed his huge, heavy head on Kira's lap, then whimpered, the same soft whimper Brennan had heard on the first night after the funeral when he sat beside him on the hallway floor. Kira bent down, wrapped both arms around Coda's wrinkled head, pressed her face into his black fur, and cried while laughing. "You're too heavy. You're going to crush me to death." Coda didn't understand human words, but he understood that voice. He placed an entire front paw on Kira's lap as if he wanted to climb fully into the wheelchair, and Kira had to push him away because she was afraid he would tip it over. "Coda, get down. You weigh 150 pounds, do you know that?" Brennan stood behind the wheelchair, watching his sister hug the wrinkled-faced dog in the hospital courtyard, and he smiled. Not a polite smile, not the social smile he used in negotiations. A real smile, the first smile in 6 months. The kind of smile his men would never believe if they saw it. Jolene stood at the glass doors behind them, looking out into the courtyard. She saw Brennan smile, saw Kira holding Coda, saw the huge Mastiff trying to climb into the wheelchair. She smiled. Then she turned away, stepped back inside, and let those 3 siblings, 2 humans and 1 dog, have that moment to themselves. Jolene Mercer knew when to stay, and she knew when to leave. That was something Brennan Shaw had never found in anyone else. Ronan Voss was handed over to federal law enforcement that very night. The USB drive he had intended to use to force Brennan Shaw to his knees became his own undoing. Brennan's cyber team spent the night cracking the encrypted drive, tracing its source back to Ronan's private server in Detroit. By doing so, they uncovered the hidden archives of the Voss organization's own illegal transactions, handing the feds everything they needed on a silver platter. He had dug his own grave without knowing it. The man who was so certain he always had an exit finally discovered that the only door still open led straight into a federal courtroom. Perry left the hospital after 3 days, his shoulder bandaged, his arm hanging in a sling against his chest. Brennan had already sent his remaining loyal soldiers to storm Ronan's safe house and rescue Perry's daughter the moment Ronan was pinned down at the platform. Now, as the car taking Perry home stopped in front of his door, the little girl, safe, unharmed, and brought back hours earlier, ran out of the house and straight into him. Perry lifted his daughter with one arm, the other still in its sling, his face twisting from the pain in his shoulder, but his mouth smiling so wide that tears ran down his face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. Brennan sat in the car behind him, watching Perry hold his daughter through the window, and gave a slight nod. Then he told the driver to go, without entering Perry's house, without saying anything more. Some moments don't need words. 2 weeks later, Kira Shaw was discharged from the hospital. She had gained weight again, color had returned to her skin, and her legs were steady, though still slow. She stood in the foyer of the Shaw mansion, a small suitcase by her feet, looking at her brother standing across from her. "I'm leaving," Kira said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request for permission. She said it. Brennan looked at his sister. 6 months earlier, if Kira had said that sentence, he would have found every way to keep her there. He would have said it was for safety, for family, for responsibility. He would have done exactly what his father had done, kept someone he loved beside him with reasons instead of love. But Brennan Shaw, 2 weeks after the night at the train station, was no longer the Brennan Shaw from 6 months before. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I don't know yet, but I'll find out." Brennan nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't stop her. He didn't set conditions. Kira looked down at Coda lying at Brennan's feet, his big wrinkled head lifted toward her, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes wet, as if he understood that something was changing. "You keep Coda," Kira said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's more loyal than anyone I've ever met, and you need him more than I do." Brennan looked down at the dog, then looked back at his sister. He said nothing, only nodded again, because if he opened his mouth now, his voice wouldn't hold. Before stepping out the door, Kira stopped beside Jolene, who had come to the mansion to say goodbye, quietly, the way she always stood in moments that belonged to someone else. Kira took Jolene's hand, pulled her closer, and spoke softly, just loud enough for only the 2 of them to hear. "My brother has never let anyone step into his life. For 32 years, he built walls around himself higher than the walls of this mansion. You're the first person he drove to see without needing a reason. Don't let him build that wall again." Jolene looked at Kira, then nodded. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Kira walked out the door, got into the car, and left Detroit. She didn't look back, because she knew if she looked back, she would see her brother standing at the door, and she wouldn't be able to leave. Jolene didn't stay at the Shaw mansion. She returned to Greenhill Cemetery, where the little house had been rebuilt. Simple, neat, enough for one person, and a new bookshelf. She continued watering flowers for the graves no one visited, continued pulling weeds, continued living among the dead with the calm she had learned through 27 years alone. But every week, on Thursday afternoon, an old model black sedan parked in front of the cemetery gate. Brennan Shaw stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee and a new book. Coda jumped out from the back seat, 150 pounds, rushing through the iron gate and straight into the cemetery to find Jolene. On the porch of Jolene's little house, there was a low wooden table, 2 chairs, and every Thursday afternoon, 2 hot cups of coffee sat on the table. No one remembered who had placed that table there first. No one asked. One Thursday afternoon, when the Detroit sunlight softened and Greenhill Cemetery was dyed in orange gold, Brennan and Jolene sat on the steps of her house, each holding a cup of coffee. Coda lay between them, his big wrinkled head resting on Jolene's leg, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes half closed. The dog didn't dig graves anymore. He didn't escape the mansion anymore. He didn't run 3 kilometers every morning anymore. He lay still, peaceful, like an animal that had finished what it needed to do and had finally allowed itself to rest. "This cemetery is very lonely," Jolene said, her eyes on the silent rows of headstones beneath the evening light. "I know," Brennan replied, "but lately it's been less lonely." Brennan turned to look at her. He didn't smile, because Brennan Shaw wasn't the kind of man who smiled often. But his eyes softened, in a way Perry, his men, and all of Detroit had never seen. In a way only Jolene Mercer, the caretaker of Greenhill Cemetery, could see. Perhaps the story of Brennan Shaw and Jolene Mercer would never be a love story in the way people usually tell one. There would be no confession, no kiss under the rain, no promise of 100 years. There would only be Thursday afternoon coffee, a new book every week, and a 70-kilogram dog lying between them on the cemetery steps. But sometimes, that is enough. Sometimes love isn't keeping another person beside you with chains, with agreements, or with an iron cage called protection. Love is letting them be free enough to come back because they want to, not because they have to. Kira Shaw left Detroit because she wanted freedom. Brennan let her go because he loved her enough not to turn himself into a new cage. And Jolene stayed at the cemetery because she chose to stay, not because anyone kept her there. And sometimes, the most loyal creature in the world is the one that doesn't know how to speak. He doesn't ask why, doesn't judge, doesn't demand an explanation. He only finds his way back to the one he loves, by the purest instinct, even if he has to dig through earth, run through the night, or lie waiting in front of a hospital entrance for 3 days without moving. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to support us. Share this story with the people you love, because sometimes a story can change the way we see family, love, and the things that truly matter in life. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below. We would love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can listen with us to more moving stories every day. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and a heart full of love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.